So this slide, I would like to explain this concept using a whiteboard. So first, I want to use board to explain how to calculate our oxygen consumption. We already talked about ACSM's VO2 equation is right, or sometimes we call ACSM metabolic equation. So this is the working equation of VO2 oxygen consumption. The unit is milliliter kilogram per minute equal 3.5 plus 0.1 multiply meter per minute. So if you know your exercise intensity, especially walking speed, you can calculate your oxygen consumption. Doesn't make sense? But however, this one is a meter per minute. But you are not familiar with the meter per minute, is right? But you are familiar with mile per hour. So how to convert meter per minute? Just 1 mile per hour multiply 26.8, it can be meter per minute, right? So it makes sense. So how about we calculate together at rest and when you walk at 3.5 mile per hour on the track or on the treadmill, so we can calculate its oxygen consumption. So I need a calculator. So first, how about at rest? At rest, our oxygen consumption is, this is easy, right? At rest, it means we do not walk, right? So 0, this is 0. So at rest, theoretically, your oxygen consumption should be 3.5 milliliter per kilogram per minute. Is right? Is right? And however, if you walk at 3.5 mile per hour, so how much is our oxygen consumption? Yes. So using this equation, so 3.5 plus 0.1 multiply, we need meter per minute, but we know mile per hour is right. So at 3.5 mile per hour, yeah, so we must convert meter per minute. So 3.5 multiply 26.8, 26.8, 2 is this, 26.8, right? So this number, 3.5 multiply 26.8, but our constant 0.1 is plus 3.5. How much? How about I want to calculate? So you must calculate multiplication first, right? 0.1 multiply 3.5 multiply 26.8 equal 9.38 and plus 3.5. So 12.88, 12.88, and however, just using the just 0 decimal number. So how about like this? 13 milliliter per kilogram per minute. Does it make sense? Oh, it's too low, too low. Okay, so how about like this? Yeah. So using ACSM equation, we can calculate our oxygen consumption at rest 3.5. We already know, right? And if you walk at 3.5 mile per hour, your oxygen consumption supposed to be based on ACSM equation 13 milliliter kilogram per minute. So if we just stop, right? But if you just exercise at 3.5 mile per hour, you need 13 milliliter kilogram per minute. That doesn't make sense. How about it just at rest, you need only 3.5 milliliter kilogram per minute. But if you walk at 3.5 mile per hour, you need 13 milliliter kilogram per minute. So at rest, 3.5 milliliter kilogram per minute. But at 3.5 mile per hour speed, we need 13 milliliter kilogram per minute oxygen, is right? So how about, I would like to explain more further, right? So this is the graph. Y-axis is oxygen consumption. Well, I would like to write here milliliter per kilogram per minute. This is unit, is right? And how about x-axis is kind of time. How about like this? At rest, your oxygen consumption, how much? We already calculated, is right? At rest. So at rest, how about this is the 5 and 10, but this is 10 and 5. How about at rest? How much oxygen we need? At rest, how much oxygen demand, right? So at rest, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's around here. So 3.5 milliliter kilogram per minute we need, is right? So how about just imagine the treadmill is here, treadmill. How about Dr. Gon just stand at the treadmill, right? But I just stand and really take rest and I just stand on the treadmill. So theoretically, my oxygen consumption is around 3.5 milliliter kilogram per minute, is right? So my oxygen consumption is around 3.5 milliliter kilogram per minute, is right? But however, some point on the treadmill, 3.5 mile per hour. Just put the 3.5 mile per hour and enter. Right? Yeah. So 3.5 mile per hour. Oh, how about at this time 0 mile per hour is right? How about 5 minutes for 5 minutes at 3.5 mile per hour? How about here, right? So it's here. So it's not like this 1 mile per hour, 2 mile per hour, 3 mile, not like this. 3.5 mile per hour and just enter. Class, does it make sense, right? So 3.5 mile per hour, I just enter. How about class, did you remember using YSM equation, YMCA working equation? We already calculate 3.5 mile per hour. Our oxygen consumption should be 11, 12, 13. 13 is here. How about this is 13, right? So 13 milliliter kilogram per minute is right. So it's mean. So 0 mile per hour to 3.5 mile per hour. So at 3.5 mile per hour, my oxygen consumption should be 13 milliliter kilogram per minute, is right? Is right? But however, to reach 13 milliliter kilogram per minute, right? It takes time. So when I just start the exercise, my oxygen consumption just become 13 milliliter kilogram per minute. No, it's not today, right? So it takes time. Maybe like this, right? So 3.5 mile per hour here is right. But how about just walk at 3.5 mile per hour? But still, it takes time. Cannot reach 13.5 miles is just immediately. No, it takes time. And after 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, it's reached 13 milliliter kilogram per minute and steady state. So how about class? Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Yeah. So theoretically, I don't know. Right? Theoretically, like this is right. It's reached 13 milliliter and steady state is right. Yeah. Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Yeah. But we cannot do that, right? It takes time. We need oxygen consumption reach 13 milliliter kilogram minute. We need several minutes, right? Doesn't make sense. It's really depend exercise intensity and depend your training status. Some trained athlete, I think they can reach very fast, right? How about sedentary, right? So some people do not really exercise. It took a time. How about class? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. So can you guess how can we call this area? This area, right? Yeah, doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Yeah. So and another one. So after several minutes, we reach this 13 milliliter kilogram per minute. We call steady state oxygen consumption, right? Steady state condition. Steady state condition. Sounds great. Steady state condition. And is comparatively this area we usually call oxygen deficit. Yeah. It's not really incorrect terminology, but I believe it should be updated. Right? So we usually, traditionally, conventionally, we learn and we teach this is oxygen deficit. But for me, it's not really good terminology. So if you ask Dr. Gon, which is really good terminology, and I would like to say like this. So this is steady state, is right? Steady state condition, is right? And another one, this one is energy from only mitochondria respiration system. So mitochondria need oxygen, is right? Yeah. So this case, we consume oxygen to release ATP using mitochondria. And this is kind of a steady state. So energy from mitochondrial respiration system. Doesn't make sense? Doesn't make sense. Using oxygen. However, this one is, see, this is steady state. traditionally we call oxygen deficit, but based on this is steady state, how can we call like this, right? This one is oh my goodness, non-steady state. This is perfect terminology, right? This is steady state. Why not? We just call non-steady state. So you should know, right? If you take some kind of a certification exam, they still use oxygen deficit terminology, but you must know, right? But Dr. Gon's personal opinion is, yeah, it makes sense, but however, better terminology, non-steady state. Doesn't make sense. What does it mean? Steady state energy from only mitochondrial response system. However, to reach steady state, it takes time. Is right? So before reach steady state, we need non-steady state condition. This one energy from where? Phosphagen system as well as glycolytic energy system. Of course, there are mitochondrial response system, but to release is enough energy using mitochondria, it takes time, right? So how about like this is 1 minute? We need 1 minute to release mitochondria, energy from mitochondria. But how about during 1 minute? Still we need energy to walk 3.5 mile per hour, is right? So this energy from where? Phosphagen system, glycolytic energy system. Makes sense? So non-steady state energy from where? Yes, mitochondria, but still phosphagen, glycolytic energy system. But when you reach in steady state condition, that energy from only mitochondrial response system. How about class? Doesn't make sense? Doesn't make sense. And how about here? 0 mile per hour again. So walk 3.5 mile per hour is right. Walk 3.5 mile per hour and stop. And stop. So theoretically, our oxygen consumption just become 3.5 mile per hour is right. I'm sorry, 3.5 milliliter kilogram per minute. So like this, theoretically, I said, if you stop, our oxygen consumption just become 3.5 is right. And just keep like this, right? But no, we cannot do that, right? So actually, oxygen consumption, it takes a time to reach at rest, is right? Oh, it's a little bit higher, and higher. And after like 5 to 10 minutes, depend on our like status. So how about it's reach? Is right? This is right? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Yeah, it's right. So oxygen consumption cannot reach 13 milliliter per kilogram minute. Is like a demand. And even when we stop, it cannot reach at our demand level. Is right? It doesn't make sense. So it means conventionally or traditional teaching is this is oxygen deficit. Oh, this is oxygen debt. How about class? Doesn't make sense. But this is too old concept. We should be updated. Right? So we call this one post-exercise oxygen consumption or excess post-oxygen consumption. So we call EPOC. Right? So how about class? So it's like this, right? So even low exercise intensity, high exercise intensity is more like spectacular, but even just walking speed, it takes time to reach steady state, is right? So before the steady state, we call non-steady state, which means energy from phosphagen, glycolytic, and mitochondria. After several minutes or after 1 minute, it reaches steady state. In that case, energy from only mitochondria. But if we stop exercise, theoretically, our oxygen consumption just at rest level is 3.5 milliliter, but never occur. Always oxygen consumption is a little bit higher. So traditionally, we call oxygen debt. It's not really good terminology. It should be updated. We had better call EPOC. Right? So I'll talk about more on this one, EPOC. Right? When aerobic exercise begins, the oxygen transport system does not immediately supply the needed quantity of oxygen to the active muscle because oxygen consumption requires several minutes to reach the required or steady state level at which the mitochondria respiration process are fully functional. Oxygen deficit is calculated as the difference between the oxygen required for a given exercise intensity and the actual oxygen consumption. But the term oxygen deficit should be updated So I would like to call this term as a non-steady state condition. And excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC, this is the recovery period after cardiovascular exercises where there is still elevated oxygen consumption. It can be described as the amount of oxygen consumed during recovery in excess of the which would have ordinarily been consumed at rest. Some factors that contribute the EPOC include the replacement of creatine phosphate and ATP, the conversion of lactate to pyruvate, and the resynthesis of glycogen, reoxygenation of muscle myoglobin, reoxygenation of venous blood. In addition, during this recovery period, the increased oxygen demand is needed to help body in adjusting the increased body temperature, heart rate, and ventilation rate to a resting level. So increased circulating concentration of catecholine hormone like epinephrine and norepinephrine and their effect on increased cellular metabolism. This is the article studying EPOC. Its title is a 45-minute vigorous exercise bout increased metabolic rate for 14 hours. Okay, could you change metabolic rate this term with another terminology? And how about EPOC, right? It's EPOC, right? So does it make sense? So subject completed 45 minutes of cycling at 50% watt max. Is max watt is watt max. So 57% is not really high intense exercise, but still is vigorous activity. So result is that the 45-minute exercise bout resulted in a net energy expenditure of around 520 kilocalories. This is just during exercise. However, for 14 hours after exercise 14 hours, energy expenditure was increased around 190 kilocalories compared with the rest day, right? So the author mentioned a metabolic rate, but it can be EPOC, right? Doesn't make sense. So after exercise, our EPOC is increased for 14 hours. So this is kind of benefit of exercise for weight management. So sounds great. However, many university physiology textbooks still use this concept. Is right? So you must know this terminology also. It doesn't make sense, right? So if you take some kind of certification exam, they still use this terminology. So you must know, right? Both terminology from just general textbook as well as from Dr. Wan, right? So oxygen deficit, oxygen depth. But you had a better call, non-steady state condition, and EPOC. Doesn't make sense. So if we use searching engine like Google to find this term, in this case, how about oxygen depth, right? See here, oxygen depth, the extra oxygen that must be used in the oxidative energy process after a period of strenuous exercise to reconvert lactic acid to glucose and decompose ATP and creatine phosphate to their original state. Oh, see, even medical dictionary mention lactic acid, which is not correct terminology, but you know the correct term is lactate, is right? What is the redox potential? It is the ratio of NAD plus and NADH plus proton. It describes the availability of NAD plus for metabolism. Did you remember step 6 of glycolysis? It supports continued glycolysis to regenerate ATP during intense exercise. How can maintain the redox potential or the ratio of NAD plus to NADH proton during high intense exercise? By lactate production. See this diagram at the step 6. Did you remember? Step 6, release 2 proton, 2 electron, is right. So we need metabolic taxi, that is NAD plus, right? So during high intense exercise, 2 proton with pyruvate become or is reduced to lactate. Did you remember? During high intensity exercise. And NAD plus goes back to step 6 to get more proton. So during high intensity exercise, glycolysis can continue by lactate production. Does it make sense? This is I'm just talking about during high intensity exercise. As you see here, some athlete like a football player or a soccer player use oxygen during a game. Can you answer why do football players use oxygen mask? Did you think about some reason? Maybe your younger brother, younger sister can have a question like when watching the TV, right? It's a sports game. As you are kinesiology major, you must answer it, right? Even do we really need oxygen, right, during game? So to answer this question, you need to understand our lab 3 graded exercise test, and I just mentioned about the concept redox potential. And you must understand lactate and lactate threshold and hyperventilation too. And our lab 3 is about a graded exercise test, right? Using Bruce protocol, we learn graded exercise test, right? And we call aerobic power test. And this graded exercise test is increase exercise intensity gradually. Did you remember? How about lab 1? We study Wingate power test, is right? We call an aerobic power test. Did you remember exercise intensity Wingate power test compared to the Bruce graded power treadmill test? So graded Bruce GXT test, right, is increase exercise intensity gradually. However, Wingate test just give high intensity exercise like resistance, and we see thus fatigue rate. Yeah, did you remember? This is a little bit different. It's different. Is lab compared to lab 1. Yeah. So as exercise intensity increase, there is catabolism of creatine phosphate increase. Is right. Right. However, catabolism of carbohydrate increase is right based on this graph. And how about catabolism of lipid? Lipid is the lower part, so decrease. Does it make sense? Exercise intensity increase, the lipid metabolism decrease. How about muscle redox potential? As a redox potential you learned just before, right? So it's increase or decrease. It decrease. Exercise intensity increase is decrease. And how about metabolic acidosis? If we increase exercise intensity, metabolic acidosis increase or decrease? Increase is right. And how about lactate production? If you increase exercise intensity, increase or decrease? Increase is right. And if you increase exercise intensity, you already know is right. Slow twitch, slow motor unit recruit first, and later fast twitch motor unit recruited. So recruited of fast twitch motor unit is increase, right? So increase, right? So if you exercise intensity increase, right? As exercise intensity increase, so we have this kind of factor, right? You remember from glycolytic energy system, when we learn is early of our this semester, right? So energy demand exceed oxygen supply in the ETC system. NADH plus proton from step 6 is inhibited from entering mitochondria, right? So at that time, is NADH plus proton give 2 proton to the pyruvate, and pyruvate is reduced to lactate, is right? So there is lactate threshold concept. So lactate threshold is the point at which blood lactate begin to accumulate substantially above resting concentration during exercise of increasing intensity. This is the rate at which lactate production exceeds lactate clearance. Doesn't make sense? Yeah, both concepts are important and usually expressed as a percentage of maximum oxygen uptake, like 50% of Brutmax or 80% of Brutmax. And a high lactate threshold can indicate potential for better endurance performance. So trained people have a higher lactate threshold comparing to untrained people. Like trained people, their lactate threshold around 80% of VO2 max. How about untrained people? Their lactate threshold is around 50% of VO2 max. It's like this. And lactate accumulation contribute to fatigue. Many textbook and many like social media, like YouTuber, they talk like this, but that is not correct. So how about think about heart rate, right? So heart rate and fatigue both increase, exercise intensity increase, but we know that heart rate does not cause fatigue, is right? The same is true of lactate. Is not cause and effect, right? But at the same time, well, doesn't make sense. It occurs at the same time. And what causes the lactate threshold, is right? So it increase production of lactate. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, because the lactate increase. And removal of lactate does not match product. So increase of product and removal of lactate, it does not match the product. So this is why we have lactate threshold. And fast twitch motor unit recruitment increase, it causes the lactate threshold. Right? Doesn't make sense. Because fast twitch motor unit, fast twitch muscle fiber has less mitochondria. Doesn't make sense. So if we recruited fast twitch muscle fiber which has less mitochondria, so it can release lactate more. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. And imbalance between glycolysis and mitochondrial respiration, yeah, this makes sense. And ischemia means lowered blood flow to skeletal muscle. It releases more lactate. It causes the lactate threshold. And muscle hypoxia, lowered muscle oxygen content. Yeah, this case, less oxygen, less mitochondrial respiration system. So we need glycolytic energy system. So it causes the lactate threshold. And another one, we learned today redox potential, NAD plus divided by NADH, right? So this ratio decrease, so to increase availability of NAD plus, so lactate concentration increase, so cause the lactate threshold. This slide for flow diagram of blood lactate. So left side, the factors increase production of lactate. So how about NAD plus decrease? NAD plus decrease, right? It's increased production of lactate, is right. And however, NADH plus proton and pyruvate, right? Because these two protons go to the pyruvate, become lactate. Yeah, so this is why it's increased production of lactate. And if we use more glycolytic pathway compared to the mitochondrial respiratory system, yeah, it increased production of lactate. And because of exercise intensity, increase, so we recruit more FT motor unit, more FT muscle fiber, right? It has less mitochondria, so it increased production of lactate. Doesn't make sense. And right side is a removal of lactate, but it's decreased removal of lactate. Yeah, decreased removal of lactate. So blood flow to active tissue, right? If this is a decrease, what is this, right? Blood flow decrease, right? So blood flow to decrease active tissue, right? It decrease removal of lactate. So removal of lactate is a good thing, is right? But this is decrease. Blood flow decrease. When blood flow to decrease to active tissue during like a game, during event, like half and so half a section of the game, is right? They just sit on the bench. Oh my goodness, that is decreased blood flow to active tissues, right? So even they couldn't really participate, but had better they just move around, is right, to increase blood flow. And another one here, what is decreased removal of lactate? So it's increased inactive muscle mass. It doesn't make sense, right? Inactive, right? So just stay on the bench. Oh my goodness, it's increase in active muscle mass, right? So it's not good for removal of lactate. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. So if they want to keep like what is active, So they had a better move around. It helped increase removal of lactate. Doesn't make sense? Doesn't make sense. And another one, how about lactate and proton, right? How about like this? Lactate from glycolytic energy system and proton from ATP hydrolysis and live together via a certain shuttle, is right? Lactate go, proton go, right? And proton with bicarbonate ion in the red blood cell, is right? Become carbonic acid and become CO2 and water, and through the lung, the CO2 can be released to the air, is right? Do you think that's it? But this CO2 will be dissolved in the ocean and with water become carbonic acid again. Wow. And become further bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ion. And this hydrogen ion can contribute ocean acidification. Wow. Wow. So since the Industrial Revolution, there has been a sharp increase in atmospheric CO2 as a result of human activity, primarily from burning fossil fuel. See, wow, human activity can increase CO2 level. Does it make sense? Wow. And how about return to the question during the lecture I asked you, right? Why do American football players use oxygen mask? Right? The question. Somebody say like this, they work so hard, they cannot breathe. And next one is to help them breathe better and perform better. Since they are legal, they use them. To give them oxygen in their lungs so they could have endurance, stamina, and energy. See, it sounds like it's not really scientific, right? Understanding is right. So it's here. Here, this is nonsense. If players are out of breath during a game, it's because of physical exertion. Doesn't make sense. Not lack of oxygen. The only benefit of extra oxygen is for players going to higher altitude where the air is thinner. Right? Doesn't make sense. This concept we'll talk about after fall break. We'll talk about this concept after fall break when I teach the respiratory physiology. And another one, how about this is like a study about the oxygen breathing, and the result is here. We found that breathing 100% oxygen produced no significant difference. Is it right? See, this finding offer no support for the use of supplement oxygen in athlete event. How about class? Yeah, doesn't make sense. Doesn't make. We do not need. But we'll talk this one is more detail after a fall break. How about if you have a still question? How about Dr. One, right? It sounds like to buffer our proton metabolic acidosis is right. We should release more CO2. So how can we release more CO2? How about class? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. And you know we can get this kind of answer from the dog, right? How about here? Wow. Oh, it's very rhythmical. Done? So cute, right? So to explain this one, why dog pants, right? See, how about after walking with the owner, right? After walking with the owner, right? So dog couldn't sweat, right? Yeah. So inside is the body temperature increase as well as proton increase after exercise, is right? So this proton should be get rid of. How to do? This proton, right, with bicarbonate ion become carbonic acid, is right, and become CO2 and water. And to release CO2 efficiently, dog pant. Oh my God, how smart is right? Is right? We call hyperventilation. So this is like to explain why football player doesn't need oxygen mask and why dog pants, right? To explain this one, you must understand like this kind of diagram. But I believe you all understand. Thank you very much.